pioneer of business, being a Hollywood mogul, owning a studio. And out of that comes this talk. And I started thinking about who were the early pioneers of TV, both men and women. And the women's story intrigued me because television seemingly was a man's world, as was movies. All the movie studios were owned by men. And basically, a lot of radio was men-centric. Anyway, so who are the early pioneers of television, women pioneers? Well, Gertrude Burke, who was also an early pioneer of radio, and during her day, she was bigger than Oprah. Betty White, of course. Mary Kay Stearns. Interesting story with Mary Kay Stearns and her husband Johnny there and the baby. Hazel Scott. Dagmar, who was Marilyn Monroe before Marilyn Monroe, at least on TV. The Beulah Show. Lucy, of course. Dinah Shore, see the USA, drive a Chevrolet. The Donna Reed Show, which was a remarkable show in its concept. I never really gave it much of a thought. It was just a show that was on with a heartthrob, Paul Peterson, but there was more to the show than met the eye. A woman by the name of Erner Phillips, who was not on TV. She was a writer. Faye Emerson, who was Johnny Carson long before Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show. Martha Rountree, a newswoman who is a pioneer, along with Pauline Frederick, also a pioneer of the early days of TV. And early Chicago TV. Well, the early Chicago version of Fran Kukla and Ollie. And there was Fran Allison. Kukla, Fran, and Ollie starred at the experimental TV station over in Chicago, W9XBK. Bill Eddy and his people were recruiting talent from across the street at the Chicago Theater to appear at their station. There were no schedules. There were no announcements. Anything could happen. Anybody could walk in. You could walk in off the streets and do some television. Burl Tillstrom was the first face to be seen over W9XBK. His show, Kukler, Fran, and Ollie, would be one of the station's first regularly scheduled shows and be one of the first shows that would be seen around the country, at least as far as being a children's show. Mary Kay Stearns and Johnny. Nobody remembers the Mary Kay and Johnny show, but it was a groundbreaking show in its day. Part of the problem was it was on the Dumont network, and Dumont made great TVs, a great television set, and they went into programming, owning a network, because they wanted to sell TVs, except they didn't know how to program a network, and ultimately Dumont would fail by 1955. But one of the shows they had on starred Mary Kay and Johnny, Mary Kay Stearns and Johnny Stearns. Mary Kay Stearns, who with her husband Johnny starred in the Mary Kay and Johnny show, which started in 1947, and the show had many firsts. Stearns becomes pregnant, and they incorporate the pregnancy into the show during the 1948 season, except nobody remembers that she was pregnant. It would come back as an issue about 4 years later on TV. It was also the first show to feature a married couple, sharing a bed. Now, in the 1950s, there were all kind of strange rules about men and women who were married. There were separate beds, and if somebody sat on one of the beds, they had to have 1 foot on the floor and 1 foot on the bed. I have no idea why. Nobody else had any idea why. Maybe it had something to do with the code in Hollywood, the do's and don'ts, the censorship of movies. The kid is born, and the kid is part of the show. The show would go from Dumont to NBC to CBS, but there were maybe 11 million TVs by the time the show ends in 1950. So nobody really even saw the show. Nobody remembers the show, but it was a groundbreaking show in the fact it became the first show to show a visibly pregnant woman on TV and maybe in the movies for all we know. Arlene Francis. There she is with Kitty Carlisle's husband, Moss Hart, Broadway He was on Broadway, a writer for Broadway. And Arlene Francis was an actress, and she is the first game show host. It's a dating show, and it comes over from radio. And most of the shows, the early days of TV, most of the shows had some identification with radio. On May 5th, 1949, Arlene Francis becomes the first woman to host a game show on television. It's called Blind Date, which originally started as a matchmaking radio show. The show would last 3 years. Arlene Francis would also be the host of a show called Home. Now, Pat Weaver, Sylvester Pat Weaver, who is an advertising guy who develops shows for NBC. You probably know his daughter, Sigourney Weaver. Anyway, he came up with something called THT. Tonight Show, Home Show, and the Today Show. Actually, it was the Today Show, Home Show, and the Tonight Show. And Arlene Francis was the host. Now, this is a show targeted at women, except it was targeted at the wives, basically the wives, of well-to-do men. That's what they wanted. Home was an American daytime television program hosted by Arlene Francis. It was for women, debuts in 1954, and it's one of the 3 non-prime shows that NBC has, Today and Tonight being the other 2. The executive, Pat Weaver, began planning this concept. It was called Shopping in the late 1950s, early 1950s, 1951. And they wanted an audience of upper middle class women. Excuse me, please. Its content and segment format were inspired by the success of women's magazines, probably Good Housekeeping and other magazines of the day, which are for the most part, are gone today. Local cooking shows and the NBC network show Today. By aiming for a particular target demographic, the network hoped to attract sponsors from women's magazines who would not be interested in advertising on the show meant for broadcast, not narrowcast. This is a narrowcast show, show for the masses. They weren't interested in that. They just wanted a specific audience, targeted audience. The show failed to get a large audience and was canceled in 1957. Okay, here is the woman who probably was the Oprah of her day, except she actually could write scripts. But she had all kind of other marketing gimmicks that were going on all over the place, except she had this talent that she could write, which Oprah doesn't have. Gertrude Berg was born Tilly Edelstein in New York City in 1898. Tilly's father, Jake, ran a resort in the Catskill Mountains where Tilly worked and eventually created and performed skits to amuse the guest children. She meets an older man, Louis Berg, one summer at the resort. He was English. He wooed her, and when she turned 18, they got married. Now, when I'm doing this for a New York audience, I talk about the Catskills because the Catskills in the 70s and 80s used to have singles weekends, and people would flock up to the Catskills and go to these dances and all that other stuff, and they could relate in the New York area to that. Anyway, the couple moved to New Orleans because Berg had a career as an engineer on the sugar plantation until a fire burnt down the sugar plantation. So it's back to New York. And Tilly decides, hey, look, I think I have ability to write, and maybe I could act a little bit. And she changes her name to Gertrude Berg, taking her husband's last name. And then she begins writing radio scripts about a fictional family called the Goldbergs. It was a combination of her mother's maiden name, which was Gold, and her husband's last name, Berg. The Goldbergs premiered on radio in 1929. Remember, NBC at that point was only a 3-year-old radio network, and CBS was only 2 years old. That was it. So she is among the pioneers of the early days of radio. In fact, she predates Jack Benny by 3 years, who had probably the longest running successful radio show from 1932 to 55. And Gertrude decided, well, until I find another actress, I'm going to be Molly Goldberg. She was so good that when she was sick for a week and missed the show, the public sent in mass amounts of fan mail asking, where's Molly? She stayed. And there she is in front of the NBC microphone. Now, She was the highest paid person in radio. In 1936, she signed a 5-year, $1 million contract, probably worth about $20 million now, with the sponsor Procter & Gamble. And by the end of the decade, she was making a reported $7,500 a week to produce, write, and star in her own radio series. During the height of her radio program in the 1930s, Berg was polled as the second most respected woman in America, after Eleanor Roosevelt. She wrote and performed an original sketch for NBC TV. Well, it was W2XBS Channel 1 in New York, which was basically RCA TV, but now it's considered NBC TV. And she considered a live stage version of the Goldbergs as a means of testing its visual appeal with an eye on TV. After the war, in 1948, she puts on a play on Broadway called Me and Molly. The show lasts about 156 performances, or only 156 performances, which 8 shows a week times about 19 and a half gives you 156. So it was on Broadway for about 5 months. And it was long enough to convince that it was time to make the move to TV. The Goldbergs premiered on CBS in January 1949 to significant fanfare and critical acclaim. Remember, this was a very, very, very popular radio show, and Gertrude Berg was a one-woman industry. And there she is with Philip Loeb, her TV husband, and that would be her undoing, Philip Loeb. Gertrude Berg was lead writer, star, and producer, and the Goldbergs climbed in popularity. In 1950, Gertrude Berg won the first Best Actress Emmy in history. The Goldbergs nominated for the Best Kinescope Show. And she had a line of clothing for housewives, and she published the cookbook. And she even wrote an advice column called Mama Talks. Her television show was made into a movie called Molly by Paramount Pictures, with Berg on the set and in the editing room exerting. She was the screenwriter and producer as well. So she had her hand in every aspect of that movie and also the TV show. Here it comes. Here comes her undoing. The blacklist, McCarthyism, the House on Un-American Activities. They're looking for communists everywhere, starting with a Hollywood Reporter in 1946, and then 1947, the House on Un-American Activities began looking for communists in Hollywood, and they got 10. They all ended up in jail, including Dalton Trumbo. Anyway, Red Channels was a pamphlet that was put out in those days, and generally it had the names of who allegedly were communists. Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television. Gertrude's co-star, Philip Loeb, an active union organizer among actors, was listed. There is the blacklist, the report of communist influence in radio and television. The sponsors pulled their support for the show. Gertrude was faced with a dilemma: find new sponsorship or fire Loeb, who was her friend and she had great stage chemistry with. She appealed to the sponsors, give us a chance. She appealed to Bill Paley and CBS. And then she went to Cardinal Spellman of New York, and he says, listen, I'll help you, but you got to convert to Catholicism. She was Jewish. There's no way she was doing that. Oh, also at CBS, there was a lot of censorship in the early days of TV, whether it was NBC with its Camel Caravan of News with John Cameron Swayze. They had censorship to the point where NBC couldn't show the Korean War in 1950 on that show. CBS had employees taking loyalty oaths to the United States in 1950, and Berg resisted network demands to fire her. CBS and the sponsor General Foods canceled the Goldbergs in 1951, and she won the first Emmy Award that year on television as the Best Actress. So she is now without a show, and it's not her fault. The show is put on hold for about 2 years. Finally, she gets a new Mr. Goldberg. She cast Harold Stone for 1 year on NBC. And then there's Robert Harris as a replacement. Neither worked. Sponsors and viewers were scarce. They were scared off because of the Red Scare and the communist allegations against Loeb, even though Loeb wasn't on the show anymore. NBC canceled the show again, and Dumont picked it up. They had no money, and by this point, the Goldbergs' time had passed. McCarthyism and blacklisting won. Oh, Gertrude, she was also blacklisted as a communist supporter through her association with Loeb. What you're going to find in this talk a little bit is that women own their shows, and the blacklist was never far away from the women. There is Philip Loeb. In 1955, he was unable to work and support his schizophrenic son, even though Berg was sending him some money. Loeb committed suicide, and Berg was left to deal with her ruined career. The movie The Front, done in the mid-'70s with Woody Allen and Sammy Mostel. I know somebody who knew Sammy before he was zero. In fact, the guy's name was Guy Friedman, and he was a real communist. He was still a communist going into the 21st century. He was in his 80s by that point. Anyway, Berg was left to deal with a ruined career. Loeb had checked himself into the Taft Hotel in Midtown Manhattan under a false name and took a fatal dose of sleeping pills. I'm going to leave this up there for a second or two or three, longer than the other pictures, so you could see who that is. That is Betty White, believe it or not. I hope Facebook doesn't take you down for this. She's the Nine of Hearts. Betty White was not photogenic. The picture was taken at a time when she was probably 20, 22 years old. She was trying to be an actress, and she was looking for some extra money. And she went to a photographer, never knowing that she would become the Nine of Hearts. In fact, David Letterman brought this up, and she said, well, it kind of looks like me, but I don't remember doing it. Well, she did. Betty White, not photogenic. And yet she was on TV from 1949 on, right? Until she did a commercial. She was still in the 20 teens doing stuff. After World War II, White made the rounds to movie studios looking for work, but she was always turned down. She was not photogenic. She started to look for jobs on radio where it didn't matter what you looked like. First radio jobs included reading commercials, playing bit parts, and sometimes even doing crowd noises. She made about $5 a show, about $95 a show now. She'd do just about anything, singing on a show for no pay or making an appearance on a local game show. But TV was coming. TV was new. It needed bodies and content. This would be her first primetime show, Life with Elizabeth, which came out of her first show. Betty White was the most prolific female of 1950s television. She was constantly attacked by newspaper critics. I never understand newspaper critics or gossip columnists. Why gossip columnists had such sway, like Walter Winchell and Heather Hopper back in the day. Today, I guess the gossip columnists are still around, but they're on TV. Open war was declared on White, who with her safe, exuberant demeanor was said to represent everything. That was wrong with the medium. During the first decade of television, she was often dismissed as too perky, too saccharine, even vacant. But she got an award, didn't she? That's young Betty White back when she was in her 30s. The 1949 TV show, which was called Hollywood on Television. The disc jockey, and this is Betty White talking. The disc jockey, Al Jarvis, saw me on Grab Your Phone, and he asked me, would you like to be my girl Friday? I started a television show, she recalls. Turned out I was to be his girl Friday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. He was going to be on 5 hours every day. That's how he did his radio show, and he wanted to do the same thing on TV. He said he'd pay me $50 a week. $50 a week, I was in heaven. The name of the show was Hollywood on Television. We played records, and in between records, we'd talk a little. But while the record was on, the audience would see us moving around, talking to each other. After the first week, they called in and they said, it's driving us crazy. We need to know what you're saying. So they scrubbed the records and threw out the turntables, and we would ad-lib for 5 hours. 5 hours a day, they would talk to one another about anything. Can you imagine talking to somebody 5 hours a day and then 6 days, 5 days a week, 6 days a week it becomes, and just talking. and talking and talking and talking. Well, there was only one other station on at the time in Los Angeles, so it was either us or the test pattern during the day. The show was so successful that after 3 weeks, they extended it to another show on Saturday and stretched it from 5 hours a day to 5.5 hours a day. We were on 33 hours a week, ad lib, nothing scripted. They had to figure out what to talk about. And there is Betty White on television. Jarvis leaves the show in 1951 because he's all talked out. He has nothing left to say after 2 years. So the film star, Eddie Albert, who was not really a film star, he was the film star, which meant he was a film performer. Eddie Albert took his place and co-hosted with Betty White for 6 months until the 33.5 hours of live ad-lib television per week featuring just the two of them took its toll and he quit. White was then hosting the show alone, talking to herself for 5.5 hours a day. It's believed she is the first, or was the first female television talk show host as a result, although I think it probably was, well, it was probably Faye Emerson, but Faye Emerson didn't last all that long and she kept going and going and going. So I would think it'd be Faye Emerson, but she's credited as the first female talk show host. After a period of White talking directly into the camera lens for hours at a stretch, the show began accepting guests to interact with her, as well as gradually incorporating scripts and sketches. One sketch involved White as a housewife by the name of Elizabeth, and that catches on and would turn into a half-hour sitcom. That was the next step. The series pianist George Tibbets began writing the sketches. The studio producer Don Featherson, who would go on to other things like My Three Sons. Anyway, Featherson, Tibbles, and White formed a production company called Bandy Productions, named after Betty White's dog. Why not? She was an animal lover, named Bandit. And White changed over to the half-hour sitcom format based on the Elizabeth sketches, and it was entitled Life with Elizabeth, and it ran in syndication for 2 years. There are 65 episodes, and they occasionally pop up on TV here and there all these years later. But she owned the show, or part of the show, as did Gertrude Berg. Oh, there she is on TV, Geritol. Feel stronger fast, iron poor blood, and all that. It's going to give you a lot of pep, especially if you were old like me, 66. But it's snake oil. That's what it was. But it was a major sponsor early days of TV. And there she is pitching Geritol. Don Featherson made a deal with NBC for a 30-minute, 5-day-a-week noontime show. It would be the second program entitled The Betty White Show, the first one, of course, being in Los Angeles when she was doing the 5.5 hours a day. It would be her first network exposure, even though she could have been on the Today Show, but she turned that down. Today Show started in 1952. Once again, a mixture of songs, light comedy sketches, and celebrity guests. She would follow Home, hosted by the popular Arlene Francis. Betty and Arlene would become two of the great game show panelists. Arlene Francis on What's My Line, and Betty on Password, and Match Game with Gene Rayburn, and a whole slew of other game shows that she did. Anyway, the Betty White Show was initially a big success. We were doing so well at noon, the kids would come home for lunch, the mothers would get their work done, and they could tune in, and our ratings kept going up and up and up. Don Featherson theorized why the newcomer, Betty White, had instant appeal. Women like her because she isn't in competition with them. Men like her because she's the kind of girl they'd like their daughters to grow up to be. And Betty explained to a newspaper guy by the name of Bob Thomas what the viewers could expect. We'll have a nice, easy show, not one of those real fast slam bang shows that you feel you have to sit there and watch. Women are too busy during the day to do that. They want the kind of show they could look at between chores around the house. Well, in the 50s, you get that visual, but I do a whole series of talks from 1950 to 59. And one thing you learn after I looked into everything to do, what basically is 10 hours in the 1950s talking about it. And you could throw this in, that's another hour, and the Lucy show, that's another hour, so that's 12 in the early days of TV. So I've done enough research for 13 hours of 1950s. It's not true what she said, because there were more women in the workplace in the 1950s than ever before, partially because women worked during World War II and didn't want to go back to be housewives. That's partially. And also women were not happy with their lot in life being a housewife. So some of that's true and some of that isn't true. One of Betty White's last tweets was in 2021, and it involved Arthur Duncan. And anyway, Betty White or somebody put out this tweet. In 1954, Betty White was criticized after having Arthur Duncan, a black tap dancer, on her show. White said, "I'm sorry, live with it." And she gave Duncan even more airtime. Her show was canceled soon after. And Betty White in 2021, "What can I say? I'm one badass bitch." The Arthur Duncan problem. In the early 1950s, White faced criticism for featuring Arthur Duncan, a black tap dancer and singer, on a few episodes of her variety talk show, The Betty White Show. Duncan said, "I credit Betty White for really getting me started in showbiz." White described that all through the South, there was this whole ruckus. They were going to take the show off the air if we didn't get rid of Arthur because he was black. White said she wasn't going to budge. Evidently, through the South at that point, it was a very, very heavy thing. And I said, "I'm sorry, but he stays. Live with it." NBC changed the show's time slots, and the show suffered lower viewership. By the end of the year, NBC kicked it off the air. But Betty White stuck to her guns, and Jim Crow would win out. Hazel Scott, she was the darling of the Cafe Society in Greenwich Village in New York. Brilliant piano player. She went to Juilliard. Okay singer, but brilliant piano player, and she was an actress. And made demands on the set in the 1940s. She's also the first African Caribbean, African American person of color ever to be the host of a television show. And why I give the African Caribbean, African American part to it is because she was born in Trinidad and moved to Harlem when she was 4 years old. She was the darling of the Cafe Society. In 1939 in New York City, she captivated audiences with her renditions of classical masterpieces by Chopin, Bach, and Rachmaninoff. Nightly crowds would gather at Cafe Society, New York's first fully integrated nightclub, the epicenter of jazz and politics and communism, nestled in Greenwich Village, to see her. While in high school, Hazel hosted her own radio show on WOR in New York. After winning a local competition and performed gigs at night, she made her Broadway debut in the musical review Sing Out the News. Commercial recordings of her Bach to Boogie record on the Signature and Decca labels would break sales records nationally. And there she is with her piano, Hazel Scott. She was one of the first black entertainers to refuse to play before segregated audiences. Here's where she gets in trouble in Hollywood. She becomes a troublemaker. So they said. In Hollywood, Hazel successfully challenged the studio's treatment of black actors, demanding pay commensurate with her white counterparts and refusing to play the subservient roles in which black actors were commonly cast. She would wear no maid uniforms or washerwoman rags and insisted that her name credit appear all the same in all films. Hazel Scott as herself. And here is the romance, the absolute power couple of the 1940s. You could talk about Beyonce and Jay-Z or all you want, but before them, there were them. Hazel Scott and Adam Clayton Powell. Hazel Scott began a romantic affair with the Harlem, New York preacher and politician Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was making a bid for the U.S. Congress. 12 years her senior, married and a womanizer, Powell pursued her with vim and vigor. At first, she was annoyed by his advances, but eventually the irritation gave way to some real interest and passion. the couple began seeing each other in secret. Amidst a great deal of scandal, the couple married in August of 1945 and were a power couple because he gets elected to Congress and she's a big star. So big that the Dumont TV network decided, let's put Hazel on television. And they do. July 3rd, 1950, the first African Caribbean, African American, or person of color woman to host a television show, man or woman, on the Dumont network. The show came to an abrupt end on September 29th, 1950. She's named in red channels. That's the pamphlet I spoke about a few minutes ago that listed supposed communist sympathizers in entertainment, and that was on June 22nd. But the show would start, and she decides, I'm going to go clear my name. I'm going to clear my name in September of 1950. So she goes before the House on Un-American Activities Committee in Washington to defend herself. Wasn't a good move. The sponsors drop her, and then Dumont cancels the show. What was the problem? Here it is. She is a victim of circumstances. Hazel's association with Cafe Society, the Cafe Society, suspected communist hangout, along with her other civil rights efforts, made her a target of the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was neither a member of the Communist Party nor a communist sympathizer. And she said, hey, I'm going to go and speak to this committee. And her husband, the Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, said, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. She did, and her career was ruined. Before there was Marilyn Monroe, before there was Jane Mansfield, or my friend Mamie Van Buren, yes, I'm friendly with Mamie Van Buren, there was Dagmar. She was the blonde bombshell. Dagmar, she was on Broadway Open House. That was the first network NBC late night comedy show, preceded the Tonight Show. Jerry Lester and Maury Amsterdam were the hosts, but Morley left the show. Maury left the show, not Morley Safer, Maury Amsterdam. And that left Lester as the sole host. A woman by the name of Virginia Ruth Egner, who gets married to a guy by the name of Lewis and changes her first name to Jenny, was part of the show, Jenny Lewis. Audience loved her deadpan delivery of punchlines and deliberate misuse of words. In one skit, she appeared as a character by the name of Dagmar, and the name sticks. Dagmar, during World War II, she moves from West Virginia to New York City and finds work as a sweater model and a Broadway actress. The sweater model days served her well. Because of her bosom, she became TV's first blonde sex symbol. As Dagmar, she was instructed to wear a low-cut gown, sitting on a stool, playing the role of a stereotypical dumb blonde with tight sweaters displaying her curvy 5'8" figure. And they gave out these measurements for her, 42, 23, 39. They used to do that all the time. Don't do that anymore. Her dim bulb character was immediate success, soon attracting much more attention than Jerry Lester. Dagmar was the star of the show. And I guess she was the Kim Kardashian of her era because she did have two assets. As an aside, a number of years ago, I'm doing a talk to the early days of TV at a senior residence in Glen Cove, New York. And there was this guy there who's about 90 years old. And he starts panting. And, you know, he's about 90 years old. And I'm talking and I see him panting. I say, you okay? Should I get some? No. So, well, what's the problem? He puts his hands like this in front of his chest. They were my hands, not standing up. I could stand up, do that. And he said, no. She was the best breather on TV. She was the best breather on TV. And he was probably a young guy at the time of about 25 years old watching this 72 years ago. So it'd be 97 now. And there is Dagmar. And there is her low-cut dress. Lewis quickly showed that regardless of appearances, she was quite bright and quick-witted. She appeared in sketches, and Lester made occasional jokes about her hidden talents, whatever they were. In 1952, she briefly hosted her own show called Dagmar's Canteen. I remember this is in the middle of the Korean War, and there were a bunch of armed forces guys who would come up there and perform a skit with Dagmar in the canteen. Didn't last long. She did variety and game shows throughout the 1950s. She drifted out of the spotlight after the 1950s, but she would continue in nightclubs singing. And she's forever immortalized by Harley Earl, who designed GM cars. That is a Coupe de Ville Cadillac. And check out the bumpers there. For whatever reason, those nose cones were put in front of the bumpers of various GM cars, and they got the name, the Dagmar bumpers. When the Dagmar bumpers first came out, they were all chrome, but they inflicted so much damage to cars that were rear-ended by them that GM put black rubber tips on them to minimize damage. But the rubber tips gave them a look like they had pasties on them. It was just a couple of weeks ago. I saw this car in the McDonald's parking lot. I was speaking in the building behind the roof there. And I went to McDonald's because I wanted to get an ice cream sundae. And I said, wow, look at that. It's a 1957 Chevy, complete with the Dagmar bumpers. The Beulah Show. The Beulah Show, 1950 to 53, the first TV show to prominently feature a black character. Beulah was a black maid serving a white suburban family. Beulah, the queen of the kitchen, came over from radio. It was on radio. It was on the ABC. Dispensed wisdom to the ever-bumbling Henderson family and to her friend Oriole. Three actresses played the title role. The first, Ethel Waters, whom the network replaced with the Academy Award-winning and Gone with the Wind performer, Hattie McDaniel, and then Louise Beavers, who replaced McDaniel when she became ill. And there are the three Beulahs, Waters, McDaniel, and Beavers. Waters starred as Beulah for the first year of the TV series before quitting in 1951. When the production moved to Hollywood, Hattie McDaniel, the star of radio's Beulah, was cast in the title role. That would be in the summer 1951. But only filmed 6 shows before falling ill. She was quickly replaced by Louise Beavers in late 1951. Beulah came under attack from many critics, including the NAACP, which accused the show of supporting stereotypical depictions of black characters, with Beulah viewed as a stereotypical mammy, similar to Aunt Jemima. The NAACP also went after the Amos and Andy show, the radio show that started in Chicago around 1927 and got over the TV. It was white actors who played Amos and Andy on TV, black actors who played them on, Amos and Andy played by white actors on radio, black actors on TV. The NCAA went after that show because of the same reason, stereotyping, and that show was canceled in 1953. Lucy. I love Lucy. Lucille Ball, actor. She wasn't a comedian, she was an actor, but she did perform comedy on TV. And she performed comedy on radio. And the I Love Lucy show comes directly out of radio. It's basically the same premise that it was on radio, except she wasn't married to a guy who was in showbiz. My Favorite Husband show on CBS Radio. In 1950, CBS approached Lucy about doing a weekly program on TV, and she jumped at the chance. She was a journey woman actress at that point, did whatever she could do to survive in Hollywood. Stunt girl, B movies, radio, you name it. That's what she tried to do. And she really had no leverage. And she was also 39 years old at this point, hardly a starlet. She was a middle-aged woman. But she was doing well on the show, My Favorite Husband. And a lot of those radio shows were tried out on TV, and CBS decided, let's try it out. But she has no leverage, but she decides to negotiate, and she was a tough negotiator. She wanted her real-life husband, Desi Arnaz, a Cuban exile, to play her husband on television, possibly to save her marriage. CBS executives said, no, not interested. CBS and the potential sponsor Jell-O, General Foods, thought the American public would not accept Desi, a Cuban exile who left Cuba in 1933 after the Sergeant's Revolt. Batista comes in, throws over the government. Desi's father is a politician. Desi's family is connected to the Barracardi rum family. They're gone. They're thrown out. They leave with literally the shorts on their back. They end up in Miami. So he has this thick Cuban accent, right? This is a problem. How could you, Cuban exile can't be the husband of a red-blooded American girl from Jamestown, New York, can she? Jello and CBS said, hey, you know, the radio show, Richard Denning, does a good job as your husband. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. He'll continue as a co-star. Jello said, Jello or General Foods said, we're out of here. CBS is still talking to her. Lucy wanted to save her marriage, hence, get Desi off the road for 39 weeks a year. We'll do 39 shows, and maybe that'll help our marriage, which was stormy. They were married. Yeah, they really were married. Lucy tells CBS, yeah, both of us, or you don't get either one of us. And eventually CBS conceded, even though the network had a lot of doubts about Desi. After all, he was Cuban. After all, he had a strong Cuban accent they never got rid of. Oh, Desi and Lucy were an interracial or multi-ethnic couple. See, they were married, but and they were married for 10 years, but that's a problem in 1950 America. Actually, there's a problem going back 73 years at that point to 1877, when this man, Rutherford B. Hayes, became the president of the United States. See, interracial marriage was illegal in parts of the U.S. In 1950. America's civil rights movement had been stalled since 1875. Desegregation in the South ends with the 1876 presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes after the Hayes-Tilden presidential race, which was too close to call. So close that the Democrats and the Republicans decide, hey, let's make a deal and let's see where it goes. The Democrats said to the Republicans, we'll put your guy in there, Hayes. He could go into the Oval Office, but only if he does this. He ends the federal troops being in the South. He gets them out of South Carolina. He gets them out of Louisiana, and you give us state rights. That's the deal. You can have the Oval Office. You give us what you want. That's the deal that was made. Nobody really knows who won the Hayes-Tilden presidential race in 1876 because it was done by guys in the back room. Interracial marriage at that point, more than a dozen states, it was illegal. They go on tour. This is Desi doing the Cuban Pete routine. And they go on tour around the country in 1950. Why are they going on tour? Well, for a few reasons. But the main reason is, hey, they could be believable as a married couple. So CBS looks at it. The audiences like it and says, all right. Yeah, you could, let's do a show. And they say, okay, before we do a show, we'll put up $5,000 of our own money. This way we own the show, you don't. And CBS is probably going like that. Good. We have to put money up for this. Good. Because if it fails, we lose the money. But it becomes a smash hit. It's a smash hit for two reasons. Maybe the marriage is secondary. But the relationship between Ethel and Lucy, her best friend, who's in on all the harebrained schemes, that I think may have more of an impact than the actual marriage between Lucy and Desi. You know, Desi was the typical 1950s husband, stay-at-home wife, stay home, I'll make the money, and she's looking to get out of the house. Now, it sounds a lot like the basis of Betty Friedan's book that eventually came out, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. Betty started working on it in 1957, which is the year the show ended. But Lucy is trying to escape being a housewife the whole time. Lucy wanted to film the show before a live audience. She wanted Carl Frahn to be the cinematographer for the show. I'm not going to go into all the stuff about microwave connections and coaxial cable and all that other stuff. It's just too long to explain. And somebody explained it to me one day, And it made sense to me. I'm gonna just say that it was hard to do a show that looked good out of Los Angeles because it wasn't connected by AT&T microwave connections, nor were there coaxial cables laid out to Los Angeles. New York and Chicago were the TV centers. New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Washington, Pittsburgh were all connected, along with Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. So that's why New York and Chicago were TV centers, because you could do the show live, and then it was shot on kinescope. Kinescope was you put a camera in front of the TV, shoot it, faces are elongated, the colors, the dark colors are darker, and it looks terrible, but you could still see 1950s shows like the Ed Sullivan Show because of kinescope. They didn't want to do kinescope. They wanted to do it live in Los Angeles, and they said, hey, listen, we'll shoot on 35 millimeter film. It won't have to be broadcast live. It won't run a whole bunch of cameras at the same time before a live studio audience, and we'll pick up the bill. And they did. The Groucho show was done the same way, you bet your life. But you had to edit down Groucho because he'd just be talking. Earlier film series included Your Showtime, The Stu Irwin Show, and The Life of Riley. Jerry Fairbanks developed the technique of using multiple camera film production in 1950. That's when You Bet Your Life started, a year before I Love Lucy. Lucy knew talent. Lucy really did know talent. She bounced around. She started in New York in 1928, washed out in New York, washed out in acting school when she was in New York at the age of 17 in 1928, but she stuck to it. She goes to Hollywood. She's an extra in the Goldwyn. Samuel Goldwyn hired her as a Goldwyn girl. She washes out at Columbia Pictures, even though she does a short with the Three Stooges. But she studied talent, and she knew who was talented, and she knew Desi was talented. He had good comedic timing, expressive face, offered just the right amount of fluster as the husband Ricky, mispronounced or Latinized words, and added to the comedy. Within 4 months of its debut, I Love Lucy was #1 in New York. The national audience would soon follow. His show should go on for 5-6 years, as long as the writers had material, Jess Oppenheimer and Bob Carroll and Madeline Pugh. As long as they had ideas, the show should go on. Except it hits a roadblock almost immediately. Oh yeah, it's a smash hit, and CBS loves it, making a lot of money. And CBS and lets Lucy and Desi pay for the increased production costs. And it's a brilliant move by CBS. They don't have to pay for it, but they're getting commercial money out of it. They're not stuck with these films sitting on a shelf. Nobody thought anybody would want to watch a rerun. It was a deal. Lucy and Desi gets ownership rights to I Love Lucy, but they got to take $1,000 a week pay cut. But they hit the wall. Pregnancy was a TV problem in 1952. You couldn't show a pregnant woman on TV, even though 4 years earlier there was a pregnant woman on TV. Lucy and Desi almost end I Love Lucy after they found out she was going to have a second baby. It's 1952 America. It's considered too racy for a visibly pregnant woman to be on TV. Television had censorship. Lucy and Desi were not allowed to say the word pregnant. Jess Oppenheimer, the showrunner, the producer, the head writer, to the rescue. As you see him looking adoringly at Lucy, and you're looking at Desi like, what are you doing, Jess? That look is too loving. Anyway, this was at a breakup party for the season. So long till August, Desi and Lucy. Oppenheimer had an idea. Let's write the pregnancy into the show. Well, the thought at that time was a visibly pregnant woman had never appeared on stage or television before, so it's a big risk for all concerned. Lucy, Desi, Oppenheimer from the creative end, CBS and the show's sponsor, Philip Morris. But they forgot, or maybe they just weren't aware of Mary Kay Stevens in Johnny, because that was the 1948 Dumont show that did feature a pregnant woman, Mary Kay Stevens. The storyline works. CBS allowed Lucy to appear on screen during her pregnancy, and some of the scripts did address the topic. However, the executives at CBS wanted to make sure the episodes wouldn't cause very much of a stir, because Just do a little bit. Just don't overdo it. Yeah, don't overdo it. Lucy and Desi survive. According to Lucy, in the early fall, 1952, when I was beginning to look pretty big, we did 7 shows concerning my pregnancy. These films were screened by a priest, minister, and a rabbi for any possible violation of good taste. It was the CBS network that objected to using the word pregnant. They made us say expecting. So a priest, a minister, and a rabbi, they walk into a room to watch a show. The 3-man religious committee had doth protested. Remember, we got to be biblical here, had doth, right? What's wrong with pregnant? They were hardly in favor of what we were doing, showing motherhood as a happy, wholesome, normal family event. And, oh, by the way, Lucy's wearing pants here. In the 1950s, one of the rules, women couldn't wear pants. And she's Lucy. And she's making CBS and Philip Morris tons of money, more money than either one ever thought they could make. So, yeah, Lucy wants to wear pants. She can wear pants. During the second season, 1952-53, she was pregnant. She couldn't do the entire 39-week production schedule. She missed the program here and there. At that point, you just show the program once, and this would create a problem because nobody's going to watch a rerun, right? Well, they get a little lucky in 1952. The FCC allowed, which froze licenses in 1948 to just see how TV singles operated, unfroze it in 1952, and hundreds of TV stations came on the air in 52. So chances were that if you didn't, even if you did, well, the chances were if you didn't have a TV, you didn't see the show from the year before. So it would be a new show to you. Rebroadcasting some episodes from the first season worked as the reruns were rating winners and created a new area for TV, syndication. And it would make Desi and Lucy the television industry's first millionaires. Oh, about that pregnancy, Dwight Eisenhower and Dick Nixon. Dick Nixon becomes vice president. I actually knew him and dealt with him from 85 to 88. Call me Dick, please. Okay, Dick. That's what I did. Called him Dick. Hi, Dick. Anyway, Eisenhower is sworn in. Dwight Eisenhower is president of the United States on January 20th, 1953. Now, this is like a little bit like comparing apples to oranges because he's sworn in at noon Eastern time on Tuesday afternoon, 11 o'clock Central time, and Lucy is on at 8:30 on Monday night. And there are more viewers at night, obviously. But on January 19th, Lucy gives birth to little Ricky. This before Eisenhower's inauguration, and she gets 44 million Americans to watch the show. Obviously, pregnancy is not a problem. Oh, Eisenhower, he gets 15 million less viewers, 29 million. Well, they survived the other stuff, the interracial marriage, the pregnancy, but this one is going to be difficult to overcome. Looking for commies. I talked about Gertrude Berg and communism. Well, here they got Lucy dead to rights. Affidavit of registration. Miss Lucille Ball, actress. I intend to affiliate at the ensuing primary election with the Communist Party. Red channels. This is the world Lucy's living in 1953. Americans don't patronize Reds. You can drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. This track will tell you how. Why we must drive them out. The Reds have made our screen, radio, and TV Moscow's most effective fifth column in America. The Reds of Hollywood and Broadway have always been the chief financial support of communist propaganda in America. Our own films made by Red producers, directors, and writers and stars are being used by Moscow in Asia, Africa, the Balkans, and throughout Europe to create hatred of America. Right now, films are being made to craftily glorify Marxism. Well, you know, let me say this about that, using Nixon. In the 1930s, they did Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and even Zeppo. They were in some great movies like Night at the Opera. Not one of my favorites compared to Duck Soup or Horse Feathers. Not third or fourth down the line. But, oh, well, I don't think they were talking about that Marxism. I think they were talking about Karl Marx and Frederick Engel. UNESCO, one worldism. And via your TV set, they're being piped into your living room and are poisoning the minds of your children under your very eyes. So remember, So remember, yes, remember, when you patronize a film made by red producers, writers, stars, and studios, you are aiding and abetting communism. Every time you permit Reds to come into your living room via your TV set, you're helping Moscow and the internationalists destroy America. The Red Scare, the blacklist, involved the practice of denying employment to entertainment industry professionals believed to be or have been communists or sympathizers, not just actors, but screenwriters, directors, musicians, and other American entertainment professionals were barred from work by the studios. People like Pert Kelton, the original Alice Cramden on The Cavalcade of Stars, featuring Jackie Gleason, the variety show back in 1951. She's thrown off the air. It was on Dumont. She's replaced by Audrey Meadows. Rather than acknowledge that she was blacklisted, Gleason and her producers explained her departure was based on some heart problem. Lee Grant, the actress, living and working in theater in New York in the 1950s, Lee Grant said she knew nothing about politics and was basically uneducated. She met a guy by the name of Arnie Manoff. He was a screenwriter and a communist. She married him and ran into the House on Un-American Activities Committee and was blacklisted. She was asked to testify against her then husband, Arnold Manoff, in front of the House on Un-American Activities and refused. I was 24 when I was blacklisted. I was 36 when I got off the blacklist. And that's what Lucy is facing. McCarthyism and blackballing, the fight for America. On September 4th, 1953, Lucille Ball gave voluntary testimony to an investigator for the House on Un-American Activities. And she said it was for her grandfather, Fred Hunt. Just wanted us to, and we just did something to please him. I didn't intend to vote that way. As I recall, I didn't. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, was a big fan of I Love Lucy, and that might have helped save Lucy from being blacklisted. Lucille Ball swore to the House committee she had never knowingly aided the Communist Party, aside from placating her grandfather's many requests for room in the garage to organize with his friends. In her autobiography, Lucille observed in herself a strong conservative Puritan streak and proclaimed, "I'm the most progressive member of my family." It was for her grandfather, a progressive and a free thinker, she registered as a communist. Saving Desi Lou. I often wonder about that picture. When Desi has got his hand over his mouth, I wonder, is he thinking about what happened 20 years earlier when he was 16 years old and kicked out of Cuba? I often wonder about that picture. Before the filming of episode 68 of I Love Lucy, and it was entitled The Girls Go Into Business, the expectation was Lucy was going to be booed as soon as she walked on stage because of all that. And Desi addresses the accusation while doing the studio warm-up. He reuses the line in Heather Hopper's gossip column and Lucy's friend. The only thing read about Lucy is her hair, and even that's not legitimate. There she is at doing a radio show prior to 1943 when she got her hair redone. Shortly after signing with MGM, she gets her hair changed from brown to red. The 1943 film, DeBerry Was a Lady, debuted her new hair and earned her the nickname Technicolor Tessie, not a natural redhead. And then there's one more thing they had to overcome. Confidential magazine. In 1955, Desi Arnaz was cheating on his wife, Lucille Ball, according to Confidential. I worked for a guy, Selig Adler. Never will ever forget Selig Adler. He came out of Confidential magazine, and this is about 23 years later or so. I'm covering a school board meeting, and the woman who's the head of the school board was a Holocaust survivor named Georgette Hyde. And he said to me, "Well, you didn't describe what she was wearing." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, was she wearing a low-cut sweater?" I said, "I don't know. I didn't look." "Was she wearing a short skirt?" "I don't know. I didn't look." "How about her heels? Were they big?" "I don't know. I didn't look. I was covering a school board meeting." Well, he came out of this, he only lasted 2 weeks after that. He was gone. But anyway, he came out of the Confidential group, the Globe and all that. So anyway, according to Confidential in 1955, "I knew Desi was inviting me for more than a drink," said the Babe. There's a story from the 1940s when Arnaz and Ball were separated. Oh, by the way, the Babe quoted was a prostitute on Confidential's payroll. It was still both safe and lucrative to run a story titled, "Does Desi Really Love Lucy?" It was a tough gig for Lucy. She caught colds, had crying spells, broke 2 fingers, sprained her ankle 3 times, pulled a tendon, sweated off 19 pounds, came down with a virus, went on hiatus, recovered at the beach, fainted on stage again. The production crew set up an oxygen tank for her in the wings, and she fainted again. By 1956, it's just about over. The show took a physical toll on both of them. CBS bought the rights to previously shown I Love Lucy programs for $5 million to rebroadcast starting in 1957. The rerun industry was born. They got $5 million. They put some money into the RKO studio lot to film other shows. Ironically enough, in 1937, Lucy bombed out at RKO as an actress. Filmed in Hollywood by Desi Liu. The Culver City soundstage would be the outdoor setting for films and TV shows, including The Andy Griffith Show, Mission Impossible, Hogan's Heroes, Batman, Star Trek, and others. The show that Lucy became famous on and quit in 1951 to go on the TV, My Favorite Husband, gets on TV in 1953, starring Joan Caulfield and Barry Nelson as Liz and George Cooper. The television version of the show is on for 2.5 years, from September 53 to 55. Originally produced live at the Farmers Market near the Grove in LA at CBS Television City. The show would switch to Desi Liu for the 3rd year, which meant Lucy got some money off of the show that made her famous. There would be an occasional Lucy and Desi show after they quit in 57. And they turned down about $3.5 million to go on, but they got $2.5 million from Ford, and they did 5 specials, and that was that. Dinah Shore in 1951 made her television TV debut, or her television debut on the Ed Wynn Show, and then was on the Bob Hope first NBC television special. And she gets her own show, 15-minute show, November of 1951. In 1956, Chevrolet sponsored 2 Dinah 1-hour specials. They were wildly successful, and that leads to Dinah Shore's Chevy Show, musical variety show that ran from 56 to 61 on Sunday nights on NBC. They don't do variety shows on TV anymore, and that's a shame, because they were really good. Donna Reed. Now, I used to dismiss the Donna Reed show as just, I couldn't watch it. I couldn't watch it. Really couldn't watch it. But I did some research and learned about the show, and I have a great deal of respect for the show now, even though I still can't watch it, because Donna Reed, like Lucy and like Gertrude Berg, ran the show. She owned the show. She wrote and produced some of the episodes. 1950s women were depicted as stay-at-home mothers, which I discussed before, and they were there to cook and clean. The father of the house made decisions, but the character Donna Stone, played by Donna Reed, expressed the desire to pursue her own career and asserted herself as an equal in the marriage. That didn't happen before on TV, except in Lucy, who tried to be an equal but couldn't. And she assumed the role of a disciplinarian and moral teacher to her children. The show lasted 8 years, from 1958 through 1966. Erner Phillips from Chicago, the queen of the soap operas. She was a radio and television writer who developed the modern soap opera. Phillips introduced techniques such as the organ bridge to give a smooth flow between scenes. I knew Eddie Layton. I knew him from Yankee Stadium. He was the New York Yankees organist, and he worked at CBS in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I said, on those soap operas, what was your favorite thing to do? Oh, the bad guy walking in. It's my favorite. And the cliffhanger ending to each episode. She still has a show that's on almost 90 years since she started. It's called Days of Our Lives on NBC. Her daytime radio series included Today's Children, 1938 through 33 through 38, 43 through 50 on radio. Guiding Light, 37 through 56, and on television, 52 through 2009. Road of Life, 1937 to 59. Women in White, 1938 to 42, 1948 to 1944 to 48. Which was the first hospital soap opera. She also created the television serials As the World Turns, 1956 to 2010, Another World, 1964 to 99, Love is a Many Splendored Thing, 1967 to 73, and she is credited with Alan Chase and Ted Corday in inventing Days of Our Lives. Days of Our Lives has been on for 57 years. 57 years, which is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. As the World Turns was on for 54 years. Those were her creations. You don't hear much about her, but she still has a show on. And that's 89 years after her first show went on radio. Faye Emerson. Well, before there was Colbert, before there was Kimmel, before there was Fallon, before there was Conan O'Brien, before there was Letterman, before there was Johnny and Jack Barr and Steve Allen, there was Faye Emerson. The Faye Emerson Show began airing on CBS on October 24th, 1949 in local East Coast markets. The network moved the 15-minute show nationally in March of 1950. In 1950, she also hosted a show on NBC called 15 with Faye for about 6 months and then committed to the CBS show. She was the first late-night talk show host. And her show was a potpourri category they don't use on Jeopardy anymore. I love potpourri. You don't see it on Jeopardy anymore. They should bring it back, just for old timers like me. Anyway, Emerson's show combined political conversations, such as U.S. relations with China, became communist in 1949, war with Korea, that started in 1950, nuclear arms, the Soviets all of a sudden had nuclear arms by the early 1950s, and equality for women, with guests such as Frank Sinatra and Frank Lloyd Wright, and Tennessee Ernie Williams and Edith Piaf. And the next night, send in the clowns, because there have to be clowns. Meet the Press, that is Martha Rountree, that is next to Senator Estes Kefauver. WNBT in Washington, that's where Meet the Press took place. Martha Rountree, along with being the program's co-creator for TV, producer and chief booker, also acted as the show's sole host and moderator. She is the only woman to have hosted or moderated the Meet the Press franchise, which started on November 6, 1947. Afterwards, there was Lawrence Spivak, and there was Tim Russert, and there was David Gregory, and then now there's Chuck Todd. No women, and a woman created the show. She joined forces with Lawrence Spivak, then publisher and editor of the American Mercury magazine on the show. Meet the Press began Mutual Radio, where I worked for in the 1980s, Mutual Radio, on October 5th, 1945. Meet the Press debuted on television a couple years later, November 6, 1947, on NBC TV. Rountree left Meet the Press in 1953. She had disagreements with Spivak, and they became insurmountable. She would end up on Dumont, and then after Dumont folded, she would work with the Washington Post. That is Pauline Frederick. Pauline Frederick, first network woman network correspondent, TV News, ABC, a very small network, in 1948, assigned Pauline Frederick to cover the Democratic National Convention. I got in that door because in those days, the men didn't know any more about television than the women. I went to Elizabeth Arden to learn about makeup in Bonwood Teller, which was on Fifth Avenue in New York, to learn about how to dress. And I always got plenty of advice on how I should look. Management wanted me in navy colors with austere necklines. They insisted I lighten my dark brown hair. They told me to wear contact lenses instead of glasses, and they continually had my hair teased because they said I was too flat-headed. The legacy. And there is Betty White, who recently passed away at the age of 99. Gertrude Berg survived the blacklist but never achieved the popularity she once enjoyed. She continued in showbiz, won the Best Actress Tony in 1959 for her performance opposite Cedric Hardwicke in The Majority of One on Broadway. She's totally forgotten today. Betty White's career spanned over 7 decades. Hazel Scott is also forgotten for her role as the first person of color to host a TV show. But at the 2019 Grammy Awards, Alicia Keys paid tribute to her. I've been thinking so much about the people and the music that have inspired I want to give a shout out to Hazel Scott because I always wanted to play two pianos. Hazel Scott fled to France in the 1950s to pursue a career. She returned to the U.S. in the late 1960s and ended up on General Hospital, among other things. Dagmar hung around TV as a game show guest and talk show host in the 1950s and 60s, performed in Las Vegas and summer stock. She retired and moved to West Virginia. Lucille Ball, still popular today. 2 biopics have been released on her. Faye Emerson retired from Showbiz in 1963 and went to Europe. Dinah Shore had a long TV career. Donna Reed's show was groundbreaking. Erner Phillips' influence on soap operas continues today. Mary Kay Stevens disappeared from TV in 1952 following the Mary Kay and Johnny show and some other appearances. The Arlene Francis show started in 1961 on radio, running for almost 3 decades. She was a regular panelist on What's My Line on CBS and in syndication. Martha Rountree's Meet the Press is the longest running show on American television. Only female moderator in the show's history. Pauline Frederick moderated the 1976 presidential debate. And there was Gertrude Berg on TV. And we will have to leave it here, as they say on TV. I want to thank the library for inviting me. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Anybody there?
I think maybe we don't have any questions maybe for the end of this, but I do thank you for coming on behalf of the library, and we look forward to having your second program coming up soon.
Yep.
The Title X program.
Title IX, is it?
Title IX.
Okay, so we will be speaking to you soon then.
All right.
And obviously on Facebook, they can't really do any questions on Facebook.
No, unfortunately, no, but I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.